One of the best known and written about shipwrecks off of Long Island was of the Lewis v. Place, occurring just east of Lone Hill Lifesaving Station on February 8, 1895. It occurred during a time when extremely cold weather and stormy weather prevailed on the Atlantic coast from Florida to New England. The temperature in Florida on the day of the wreck was the lowest on record, while in New York City it was 0. Wind velocities were as high as 72 miles an hour at Woods Hole, 68 miles per hour, 53 miles per hour at Sandy Hook. It was snowing all along the coast from North Carolina to Canada on the 7th and 8th. From the 6th through the 9th, the USLSS had 29 vessels with a total of 129 crew met with this storm and sea-related disasters. With the expectations of the Lewis v. Place, there was no loss of life. The 163-foot, three-mast schooner Lewis v. Place, built in 1890, sailed from Baltimore to New York with 1,100 tons of coal for cargo. She left January 28th and was off Cape Charles, Virginia on February 4th. By February 5th, she was in heavy weather, and her sails, rigging, and hull were icing up. On the 6th, the weather moderated somewhat. On the 7th, the gale shifted to the northeast, blowing violently as the weather became overcast. The ice, high winds, and bitter cold all made it difficult to handle the ship. The upper sails were reefed, and the ice made the remaining sails hard to work. Around 2 a.m. on the 8th, the storm hauled to the westward with even greater fury and wild and dangerous cross-seas. The crew had now been subjected to 4 days and nights of bitter exposure to the elements with little or no sleep. Captain Squires believed he was near Sandy Hook. By 7 a.m., the vessel was essentially a drifting iceberg, almost totally unmanageable. Her running gear frozen in blocks, her sails stiff with ice, and her deck sheathed with ice. The visibility was almost 0. By 8 a.m. the captain had completely lost his bearings, but was sure he was near land. The lead was cast, and he found that he was in 8 fathoms of water. Although the vessel was leaking badly, his intentions were to anchor so he can inform the crew and pass out rations of whiskey, urging them to move about to keep warm. The crew, in their weakened condition, were unable to cut the anchors free of the ice. The captain then ordered the men to put on all the clothing they could wear and remain on the aft part of the ship. Cutting at the halyards had made no difference. The sails would not move, so the men simply waited out whatever fate had in store for them. In about 10 minutes, they heard the roar of the breakers ahead. A few minutes later, the vessel lay pounding on the bar with the sea breaking over its deck. The crew scrambled for the rigging about 5 minutes before she hit. She was seen by a Lone Hill surfman, Frederick H. Saunders, on the beach. He ran for the station and telephoned for assistance from the 2 adjacent stations and sent a messenger eastward to notify his own keeper and crew, who were on the scene of the wreck of the John B. Manning at the time, which had stranded several hours earlier between Lone Hill and Blue Point Station. Crews from both stations had struggled through the storm with their equipment and had managed to rescue everyone on board. The 2 wrecks were about a mile apart, the Manning being the furthest east. This rescue was completed after 12 hours of hard work. The lifesavers set out to return to their stations. They were tired and frostbitten. The Lone Hill crew found it impossible to haul their bench apparatus back, so it was left for a later time. They began their trek back into the full fury of the gale, with blowing snow and sand in their faces. The temperature was between 3 and 4 degrees. The stranded Lewis V. Place was between 300 and 400 yards of the beach, near the Lone Hill Station. The surf was sweeping her from end to end, and her crew were seen in the port mizzen rigging whenever the snow squalls let up for a few minutes. The tide was high, the surf was very heavy and filled with a grinding mass of porridge ice 2 feet deep. There was a gale force wind blowing. The beach was strewn with cakes of ice, piles in some places 6 to 8 feet high. Witnesses reported seeing 20-foot breakers. Under such conditions, there was no way a boat could be launched or rowed through such a mess. The only hope of rescue was by Breach's buoy, while the lifesavers were rigging the Lyle gun. 2 men on the ship lower on the mast, where the waves constantly drenched them, were seen to drop into the sea and disappear. They later proved it to be the captain and the cook. Appalling sight so early in the rescue attempt made the would-be rescuers realize that those aboard were already in bad shape. The Lyle gun was fired, and the line landed too far from those aboard. It was fired a second time, and the line landed close enough that the crew should have been able to reach it easily. However, they made no move to retrieve the line upon which their lives depended. Today we would conclude that hypothermia had set in to such an extent that they were incapable of rational thought or action. The surfmen left the line in place and fired a third shot, which also fell within reach. When it cleared for a short time, around 1 a.m., a fourth line was fired, but it missed the vessel. Shortly thereafter, the weather closed in again, obscuring the wreck from view for about 3 hours. When it became possible to again see the wreck, there were only 4 men left in the rigging. The gun was fired a fifth time, but before it could be seen where the line landed, the weather closed in again. The short winter day was almost over. The men stood ready to fire another line aboard the moment visibility returned. A short while later, they got their chance. The line landed aboard the top foremast stay. There was still enough light to see the men on the ship, but they did not move. Darkness arrived, and with it, all hope of getting the breech's buoy to the ship before the next morning was gone. The night was wild and intensely cold. The lifesavers huddled on the beach by the beacon fire, hoping the storm will abate enough to launch the boat, but no chance came. When daylight came, almost 24 hours had gone by since the stranding, and there was apparently only 2 living men left on the wreck. The third of the 4 who had been seen on the previous day was in the cross trees near the other 2, frozen to death. The body of the 4th hung in the rigging, head downward, held by the lashings he placed around himself, swaying to and fro in the merciless gale. At sunrise, the loud gun was fired again, and the line landed on the mizzenmast, very close to the 2 remaining sailors. 2 more shots were fired. One fell across the hull. The tide was out, and the rail was out of the water. One of the men crawled down to it and feebly tried to haul it in. He was unable to. So he climbed back up into the rigging. By now, it was 3 p.m. of the second day, and any hope of rescue by breech's buoy was abandoned, as it was plain that the sailors were too far gone to aid in their own rescue. The boat was taken from the wagon to the water's edge, and several attempts were made to launch it into the icy-laden surf, only to have it hurled back to the shore. The last attempt took place at sunset. The surfmen brought the boat back up to the beach a bit, only long enough to rest and wait for another opportunity to present itself. About midnight, the tide was receding, and the surf had fallen somewhat, and the wind had slacked off a bit. 40 hours had elapsed since the stranding, and it was now or never. If the dying men were to be rescued, at least with a mighty push, they got the boat afloat with keeper Baker at the helm, and the keeper Rourke at the row. The seas were still running high, and the ice pounding the boat. At last they were able to come alongside the stricken vessel. Their shouts aroused the men in the cross trees. They carefully crept down the shrouds to the rail, where they were helped into the surf boat and were swiftly brought back to shore. Once there, they were transported to the station and cared for. Later, they were sent to the Marine Hospital at Stapleton, Staten Island, where one of them died a few weeks later. To this tragic event, there were large numbers of spectators made their way across the frozen bay on the ice by horse. At 9:30 a.m., Lieutenant McGuire, U.S. RM Inspector, 3rd District Station, arrived with Dr. Overton of Patchogue. A half hour later, Dr. Robinson of Sayville arrived, having been summoned by the keeper. The survivors were put in the care of 2 physicians. They were soon shipped off to the U.S. Marine Hospital in Staten Island. One of the survivors, Seaman Stubbins, gave the following account of the events. Captain Squires called all hands aft, gave us some grog to keep the life in us, and cautioned us to mind his orders exactly. Sometime later he ordered the men to cut the halyards, to bring down the sails, but these were too frozen stiff and would not come down. It was a few minutes after the schooner struck the beach on the crest of a big wave. We knew that was her death blow, and she bumped a few times, then settled with the slight list to port, nearly broadside to shore. Big seas broke over the deck, and the schooner plunged with every wave that swept over her. It was death to stay on deck and be swept away, while it was a more lingering death to go aloft. But we choose the latter. Captain Squires mounted the cross trees on the foremast with Olson and myself, Nelson Morris, Alan Ward, and J.B. were all in the rigging on the other mast. We were all warmly clad, but nothing could keep such cold from our bones. The wind howled through the rigging, and the flying spray froze on us. That we could hardly open our eyes or mouth, or move our arms or legs from numbness. We had been hanging for several hours when we saw Captain Squires fall with a rattling sound down the shrouds, and his body was swept out to sea by a big wave. Next went Morrison, the cook. They made no sound or cry, but dropped like logs. I believe they had been frozen to death, standing in the rigging. All that Friday, the men who remained stamped their feet on the cross trees and moved about as well as they could to keep from freezing. Several lifelines were fired across the rigging from shore, but we were too much benumbed to pull them in. All that day We hung there. It grew frightfully cold again at night, and seemed beyond human endurance. Suddenly, about 8 p.m., Engineer Charles Allen let go and went tumbling down into the sea. Soon after, JB, the big mate, died and went overboard. When morning came, I saw Seaman Ward hanging frozen and the ratlines. He had died during the night. Nelson and I were able to live through the terrible Friday night by making a shelter. We got on the mizzen cross trees and cut the lashings of the mizzen top sail that had been furled into this hole we kept and were able to keep out the wind. But the cold was frightful. Poor Olson tried to get into our shelter with us, but he was under the cross trees and unable to get around the mast and onto the cross trees. We tried our best to save him, but could not get him. He died about 2 o'clock Saturday morning, sitting where we had been for hours, on the faster than I could haul. Nelson and I kept alive by beating our arms and stomping our feet. Several lines were fired across the vessel, but Nelson was too stiff to move. So I climbed down the deck and managed to get a hold of one of the lines, but I was so numb with cold I could not haul it in. Ice formed on it faster than I can haul it in, and it got so heavy I had to drop it. Then I climbed back to our perch and beat Nelson and myself some more, and waiting for the weather to moderate Friday morning, and it was now Saturday night and growing colder. If I could have a meal of pork and beans and coffee, I could have endured the strain longer than I did, but without food, I could not have stood it much longer. About midnight Saturday, I could see, by the light of the fire built on the shore, the men coming out to us in a lifeboat. We were both badly frozen, with Nelson the worst, and it was with great difficulty that we managed to get down to the half-submerged deck. We tumbled into the lifeboat, and in a few minutes were on shore. Everything possible was done for us. It took hours of rubbing to bring back the circulation. According to Captain Baker, even the lifesavers got the men ashore. They cut their boots off and got them into warm clothing and made them as comfortable as possible. Their boots were grabbed by the crowd and cut into pieces as souvenirs. On Sunday, we launched a boat and went out to cut down the bodies of the 2 men who were frozen in the rigging and bring them to shore. Every day, slain parties of all kinds braved the cold in the crossing the frozen bay to view the scene of the tragedy. There's a light covering of snow. On Sunday, we launched a boat and went out to cut down the bodies of the 2 men who were frozen in the rigging and bring them to shore. Every day, sleighing parties of all kinds braved the cold and crossing the frozen bay, viewing the scene of the tragedy. There is a light covering of snow over the ice, and a roadway has been worn across the bay like that of a street. The two men frozen in the rigging and that of the mate that washed ashore near Forge River were buried in Patchogue. The engineer was found near Moriches, where he is buried is unknown. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle's reporters stated that it was estimated over 1,000 people journeyed on that ice across the Great South Bay from Bellport to Bayshore to view the two wrecks. The bodies presented a horrible sight, and scores of people, to satisfy their morbid curiosity, went to Roland's undertaker's room to see them. Patchogue, Advance, February 15th in 1895. The ship completely broke up within a few weeks. Only one of the masts was purchased from the owner by the village of Patchogue and is now used as a flagpole.